Direct air capture has the potential to remove large-scale amounts of carbon from the atmosphere, but it will require significant energy resources. Integrating direct air capture with renewable energy, like geothermal, can help drive down costs and address consumption concerns. Developing costs and energy-efficient technology will be imperative for long-term market success. However, this must be done in careful balance, considering the role DAC plays in overall energy landscapes. Here to moderate this roundtable is Kyle Clark-Sutton, Manager of Carbon Removal Policy at the Rocky Mountain Institute. Kyle?
Great, thanks, Abby. Nice to be with you all here today. I'm going to introduce myself really briefly and then pass it off to our expert panelists. So like Abby said, I'm a manager for carbon removal policy at RMI. RMI is a global nonprofit, although born and raised here in Colorado, that focuses on deep decarbonization for every sector of our economy to usher in a modern, equitable, and low-carbon future. We're focused not only on reducing emissions, but also the opportunity that clean energy has for public health and for our economy. In 2022, RMI launched our carbon removal initiative to catalyze development of safe and equitable carbon removal in partnership with government and industry, as well as the scientific and academic community. And we do that in a few different ways. First, research and development is a critical part of scaling carbon removal. There's a lot that we don't know yet. And so RMI works on developing technology roadmaps and assessments. Some of you may have heard of a recent publication and would love to plug it here. Our Applied Innovation Roadmap came out late last year. The AIR looks at 32 different approaches to carbon removal, including multiple kinds of direct air capture, but also across all other geochemical and biogenic approaches. And it has a lot of really helpful insights into research and development gaps and opportunities to inform R&D funding. We also support first-of-a-kind projects and deployment. RMI is a lead of a consortium in the Pacific Northwest called the Anchor on Carbon Management Hub. That was the recipient of Direct Air Capture Hub funding last year, and we're excited to kick that project off this year. And finally, we're focused on policy and market shaping. As has already been said today, without demand, this industry is not going to take off. And without policy and strong, robust MRV standards, we won't have the demand that we need to meet our targets and our goals for carbon removal. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Patricia Loria from CarbonCapture.
Thanks. Thanks for having me here. My name is Patricia Loria. I'm VP of Business Development at CarbonCapture, Inc. I think the WGA has just done a fantastic job on kind of sculpting this conversation. I went to their winter event in Jackson, and that was a great conversation too. So I think bringing together governors, policymakers, companies who are working in these Western states is just really important for us to meet these kind of lofty goals we have. I'm going to start with this picture, and go through a quick company overview, but I want you to remember this picture because it's actually pretty controversial in Wyoming. And I'll let you guys think about that why and maybe ask the question later and see what people think. Glenn here probably knows, and Randall certainly would shout up and down as to why he thinks this picture is controversial, but it certainly addresses issues around energy and direct air capture. We had a brief question that Max already answered, but the science is clear that even if we do robust decarbonization, and I believe heavily in CCS on point source projects, and I'm really excited about the leadership that Wyoming is bringing to that and looking to decarbonize its energy sector with point source projects, we've already done too much damage, and we're going to need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and remove a lot of it. I mean, we're talking billions of tons by 2050. Now, DAC isn't the only solution that's going to do that. We sit in a much wider ecosystem of nature-based and other technology solutions. But I firmly believe, which is why I work at this company, that DAC is going to be a really important part of that. It is a permanent storage solution. It is a technology that we know can work and operate. And sadly, I think that we are just at this point in our kind of global path where we're going to need these really high-tech but permanent solutions if we hope to stay below 1.5 degrees global warming and really protect the world's population from the worst effects of climate change. I wanted to give you just a picture, so Max from Heirloom didn't do you justice in kind of showing you a picture of what they're building, but here's a picture of what we're building just so people can start to have a sense. And just, I know that there's a lot of terminology that's being thrown around. We are a direct air capture company, meaning we only build these systems that take CO2 out of the air. So there's carbon capture systems that can be put on industrial emissions to take down that CO2, but that's not what we're doing. We're building these systems to take it out of the air. And this is what one looks like. This is our prototype that you can all come and visit if you'd like to see it in Long Beach, California in just a couple months. This size, which is about the size of a shipping container, and it was made to that size to be transported easily, will take about 550 tons of CO2 out of the air. Nowhere near that 10 billion we were talking about, but we got to start somewhere. We're going to catch and release this CO2, meaning we don't have a place to store it, and that's certainly a challenge as we continue to kind of evolve and this industry grows, but we're getting there with these kind of baby steps. And we already have great corporate support for kind of selling carbon removal credits from our projects. BCG was our first customer, Microsoft was the first customer, Adyen. We also sell at a platform called Patch, where any individual can go and buy CO2 from our project, Project Bison. So there's a lot of ways for corporations, individuals, and governments to kind of get involved in supporting this nascent industry. So for us, for our solution, essentially we're a temperature vacuum swing absorption, which means that we use materials that have been around for a long time and used for other purposes that bind CO2. So they're amines, and when they feel CO2, they get attracted to it, the CO2 attracts to it, and then in order to release that, we heat them up in a closed environment so that we can capture that CO2 that's released from the amines, cool it down, and do the whole process over again. And each of those reactors are essentially these building blocks, and you could just see how they build. So essentially that picture I just showed you is 12 reactors. Then those reactors go into clusters, which go into arrays. So we can kind of land and expand, build small, but continue to grow. One of the other exciting things, and I'll talk a little bit about this, and I'm sure David will talk about this when we talk about energy reductions. These solid sorbents, as I said, they weren't made specifically to address this challenge of climate change. They're things that have been used in other areas of chemicals. But right now there are companies all over the world, national labs, universities, who said, okay, you know what, we actually really need to build a lot better of these sorbents. So there's so much material science innovation that's going on, and that is going to help us drive down our costs and energy requirements. And when those innovations happen, we're just going to replace those cartridges into those reactors. So we're making capital investments, but not sorbent decisions. And that will allow us to make a lot more of these clusters while we continue to innovate on the sorbents. So just from our pathway, as I said, we're going to have this first facility up in California, and then our next facility will be a single cluster. So that is that kind of 18 modules put together. That will actually be in Arizona, and that CO2 is going into concrete as we look for kind of the next larger phase, which will go in a Class 6 well. And that's where we've been talking about our Project Bison in Wyoming. And I'm just going to skip through some of this really quickly just to share, because we're we're talking here very close to Colorado and Wyoming, that we were selected for a TA2 DAC hub in Wyoming, and that is already kind of underway. We got pre-award authorization spending to begin work. We've hired our first employee in Wyoming who's doing our community benefits. So we will be investing over $2 million of hard dollars, meaning we're going into communities like Rock Springs and saying, what can we do to help you prepare for jobs and opportunities in these sectors? And they may say, you know what, we really need infrastructure development. We really need help with buying computers at the schools. What community benefits agreements really means is that we spend a lot of time talking to communities and we figure out how to use our money in the best way to support them. And additionally, we have money for training, we have money for conservation projects. So there's a lot that we're doing to support the community. And that's really coming mostly from our money, because what we're getting from the Department of Energy is really to do a feed study, right? So they haven't committed to giving us money to actually build the facility in Wyoming. That will come from for the next phase of the project, what it's called a TA3. But we're doing everything we have in our power to show the Department of Energy and the federal government that the state of Wyoming really wants to build direct air capture. They really see this as a huge opportunity in their state for all the things that we've talked about: great geological storage, a great workforce, great opportunities for energy, and that hopefully will bring kind of jobs and opportunities to the state of Wyoming. I'm just going to kind of pop through these slides again so you can see a couple of our customers, and I am happy if you want to pop by me, if you want a copy of these slides, I am happy to provide them as well. But I am going to move on. I'll just say actually one thing before I go on and give you the clicker. So another party to our direct air capture hub is a company called 12, who is testing sustainable aviation fuel. So this isn't just a sequestration opportunity in the state. We can use CO2 to make products. We have partnerships to that. And one of those, the hugest partnerships will probably be around sustainable aviation fuel. That is a huge market opportunity that DAC can open up in any of these regions, and we're excited to see what it takes us in Wyoming.
Great. Whoop. Okay, title slide first. So, Dave Luebke, National Energy Technology Laboratory. I bet everybody here knows NRail, but I suspect there are a lot of you that never heard of the National Energy Technology Laboratory. So I figured we'd start with that. National Energy Technology Laboratory actually goes back more than 100 years. So going back to coal mining research in the early part of the 20th century in Pittsburgh, we were involved in improving the safety, improving the quality of energy production for this country. So now, today, we are 3 different laboratory campuses in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Morgantown, West Virginia, and Albany, Oregon. And for most of our history, we've been focused on fossil energy. But over the past quarter of a century, we have begun to move toward understanding reduction in the harm that the fossil energy production causes, be it particulate reduction, be it SOx and NOx reduction, and more recently, carbon management. So we're a go-go, government-operated national lab. We work directly for the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at DOE. It puts us in kind of a unique position where we go out and deal with some of these issues that are arising. Today, we're going to talk about DAC. So over the course of that history, we've, as I mentioned, worked in pollutant reduction, SOx, NOx, working with acid rain and smog reduction. And we've also done a lot of materials development for things as diverse as vehicle armor and cardiac stent materials. In the area of carbon capture, we developed the baselines for TEA and LCA for point source capture. And that has been instrumental over the past decade or so in taking us from a place where there's a big diversity of assumptions in those analyses, which leads to difficulty in comparing one technology to another and really understanding the benefits that we're creating to a place where pretty much everybody uses the same assumptions. And now we can say, well, it will cost this much to capture a ton of CO2 from these different sources, and this is what we think the total emissions reduction will be. Now, having said that, I'll tell you who I am. So I'm an engineer by training. I came to NETL in 2002 as a point source carbon capture researcher. And over the course of 10, 12 years, I went from doing membrane research to running our internal carbon capture efforts. And 10 years or so ago, I left. And I left for a lot of reasons. But one of those reasons was I didn't think that carbon management was getting the attention and the investment that I thought it needed. And so I thought, well, I'll go out, I'll start some companies, I'll do development, see if I can't commercialize some of these things and attack it from a different direction. Now, that went great. Those companies are going strong. But a couple of years ago, I saw a major change. And that major change was we got serious about investing in carbon management. And so one of the ways we did that was the NETL DAC Center. So as I mentioned, NETL's been doing carbon capture research for about a quarter of a century. And so when we started making investments in carbon removal and direct air capture, Department of Energy said to us, hey, look, it took us 20 years to get point source capture ready for prime time, right? Today we've got multiple technologies that can be installed. They can capture carbon dioxide, and that's great for point source. CDR is less developed. So how about you guys go leverage some of that expertise, some of those facilities that you have, and see if you can't work with technology developers to push this technology forward, because we don't have 20 years to wait this time. So I got excited about that when I heard about it, and I got named technical director of this facility. And so having been in startups, the first thing I did was I went out and I started talking to my customers, started talking to the DAC developers, and I said, okay, well, what do you have? What do you need? What could we do that would be helpful? And so we're in the process now of building a facility which will allow for testing at multiple scales of DAC technology in a bunch of different ways that include things like integration with renewables and increasing the longevity of these technologies to decrease cost, so that hopefully we can benefit the industry as a whole and get to implementation faster. So that's me.
Great, thank you both for the great introduction to your work. I think let's just start out with the basics, right? We all know that direct air capture requires a lot of energy, but can you two talk a little bit about how significant is the impact of energy consumption on the overall structure of the overall cost structure, and what are some of the potential pathways for reducing energy consumption for DAC?
I can start with kind of our specific example, and then you can talk more broadly across different technologies. So energy is a huge part of how our technology works. So as I said, not only is it a big industrial system, but we have this process where we heat the sorbents and cool them down. We have fans that are essentially pushing air over the sorbents. Ultimately, we have to take out that CO2 and compress it for geological sequestration. So all of those things require energy. Some of them require electricity. Some of them require thermal energy. In certain cases, we're using, or probably in most cases in the early first-of-a-kind plants, we're using electricity to make thermal energy. And so it is a pretty huge part of our cost structure. Depending on, where we're looking at in our timeline, it could be 40% or more of our overall cost. So everyone in our company is totally focused on how we reduce our energy consumption. And I've already said the first way we're really going to do that is through being the strongest material science company. So we have probably over 20 different partnerships where we're looking at building sorbents that not only can be regenerated at lower temperatures, and that has the potential to use waste heat, or at least not to have as high heat. They have more longevity, they work better. So really that kind of sorbent and how those sorbents are packaged is going to be really key to our cost reduction strategy. But then there's other things we could do as well, right? So right now we're using steam as our process to do that, regeneration, but there's potential for direct heating. There's a lot of things also then from the technical standpoint that can happen, but certainly, I'm never going to underplay kind of how important energy is to kind of the cost structure, and that energy is a big part of, and a big cost for what we do.
So I mentioned that in point source, we kind of have a set of assumptions and baselines that allows us to compare technologies to technologies, and we kind of agree on those. We're not really anywhere near that with DAC yet. We still have a lot of assumptions that are going into any given analyses. We haven't really set the bar on all of those things. So it matters a little bit where you look, what kinds of numbers you see for the importance of energy in these materials. But for the sake of argument, I think we can probably say it's between a quarter and a half of the cost of CO2 capture. So if we're talking about carbon capture from the atmosphere and we're talking about a ton of CO2, the best technologies today are saying maybe, or the most developed technologies today are saying maybe that costs $600 a ton. So if we can cut that by $200 or $300 in one way or another, well, we're pushing ourselves toward that $100 a ton goal that we think is if not necessary, certainly desirable for getting us to the place we need to be to start sequestering or capturing and sequestering 1 billion tons of CO2 a year by 2050. So I think it's critical. The other thing that I think is critical is we're talking about terawatt hours of some number of hundreds or thousands of terawatt hours of energy that we need to do DAC to get to those kinds of numbers, right? So there's a lot of energy that we need to build, a lot of capital involved in that. So anything we can do to decrease the overall energy demand is certainly going to be desirable and something that we should focus on.
Great. So I think building on that, you already mentioned material science and the opportunities to build better sorbents to reduce energy costs, but are there other opportunities for cost reduction within the technology stack that don't necessarily get at energy consumption, but get at cost of materials or something along those lines that you all could unpack?
Well, I mentioned something like direct heating, right? So right now we're using boilers. So there are ways that we can potentially recover heat in our system. So there are some parts of the mechanics, how these systems are built, that even outside of the sorbents are going to be real opportunities and cost reductions as well. When we talk about something like things like direct heating. But yeah, really getting rid of steam could have a big effect on the cost structure of our modules as well.
Sure. So I'd say that there are tremendous opportunities for cost reduction kind of across the board with direct air capture today. We talked about energy. We talked about making better DAC materials themselves. So decrease the temperature of regeneration, increase the capacity so you're getting more bang for your buck in terms of capture. But there's a lot of other ways too that you can go after this. You can look at materials of construction. So these processes are cyclic. And we're talking about big capital investments in terms of getting them built. So things that reduce the cost of materials for those, things that allow us to cycle more efficiently with smaller amounts of heat in the system as a whole. That's one example. Another example would be process optimization. So how do I best stage my process to decrease the overall energy demand, to increase the overall capture of CO2? So if I build a contactor and it captures a ton a day of CO2, well, that's great, but what if I can adjust the parameters of my process so that I can capture a little longer or regenerate a little bit more often, and so now I can capture 1.5 tons? Well, that's more efficient use of my capital, and those are the kinds of things that really move the needle in terms of overall cost.
So I think that's a great segue actually to, you mentioned this is cyclic and there are a lot of upfront costs that companies have to undertake. One of those upfront costs is integrating with clean energy, accessing clean energy, whether it's the cost of the infrastructure to connect to your facility or the cost of building the energy at your facility. I wonder if you all could talk a little bit about what are the challenges of integrating DAC systems with renewable energy and what sorts of strategies could be employed to reduce those barriers.
I'll start by saying, while we certainly are looking at renewable energy as a source, right now for our projects, we're looking at integrating with the grid. And when we think about integrating with the grid, what we care about is clean energy on the grid, not just renewable energy, right? So if the grid has carbon capture on power plants, then that reduces the overall emissions of the grid, and that benefits us. Our sales of our carbon removal credits and our LCAs are based on that overall kind of grid emissions, and so any ability to kind of reduce emissions on the grid is an important part. Now, that being said, when we talk about that integration, certainly one of the challenge I think everyone's facing, and Max Marilyn brought this up, is, right now we're also a bit at our infancy on our kind of class 6 wells, right? And we're lucky to have a partner who's going to talk tomorrow, Frontier Carbon Solutions, who's building out wells in Wyoming. But, the whole, I would say, ecosystems is a bit stuck of, do we chase the wells or do we chase the energy? Because right now, where the wells are being built isn't really that close to transmission lines where the energy is going to come from. So as we talk to Rocky Mountain Power, who has been really supportive for us in Wyoming, it's like, would we rather be closer to the transmission line and build some pipeline with Frontier Carbon Solutions, or are we better off building less pipeline and building more transmission lines? And if we're going to build more transmission lines, where do we sit in Rocky Mountain Power's queue? Is that a 2-year process? Is it a 3-year process? So these are really complex infrastructure conversations that, I think really need to be being held at even a more strategic level. So I would say still generally at utilities, when we're talking to them like we're any other customer, that, we're any other kind of producer who needs electricity, but we're really doing something more strategic, something that we hope to grow a lot larger, that we hope supports the state's decarbonization goals. And so I think we really need to be at kind of the senior levels with sustainability directors at these utilities, with the public utility commissions, with the state energy offices being like, okay, we've all decided this is really important. So let's all kind of put our heads together and kind of figure out how to kind of solve these big macro issues. Because it's really expensive.
So I'd say 3 big issues with integrating renewables and DAC. You hit on siting. You've got to have the geology, so you've got a place to put the CO2, you've got to have the energy, you've got to have the space. So that's 1. 2 is intermittency. So these are big capital investments in terms of contactors. So to compare, if you're capturing the carbon dioxide from natural gas-fired power plants, say, where you get 5% CO2, versus from the atmosphere, you got to process 100 times more gas to get the same ton of CO2 out of the air as you would at those other places. So big contactors, we're moving a lot of air, and that means lots of steel, lots of material, and so CapEx is important. And that means that when you start to play with capacity factor, you'd really like to be able to say, well, it's okay if my direct air capture contactor only operates 50% of the time, 25% of the time, something like that. But the cost really starts to go up when you decrease capacity factor. So intermittency and figuring out how you optimize the integration of DAC with renewables, that's critical. So, and then the last thing is, and this is not a problem for all of the technologies that are available in DAC, but some of these technologies require really high temperature heat. And renewables tend to create electricity, which is good at making moderate temperature heat, but not so great at, it's not impossible to do it, but it's not nearly as developed to create blast furnace level heat out of renewables. And so developing that technology and driving it forward, these are some of the things that I think we'll be working on over the next several years.
And I would just say to David's point on the intermittency, our models show intermittency to be really difficult from us because of the CapEx requirements, which is why we're looking at grid connections. So certainly, I do think that the future of direct air capture could have behind the meter generation, but with that, at least in, with that regardless at any time comes energy storage, and the costs and complexities of that are really difficult. So right now, we've made the decision that the better option is to be grid connected and deal with, decarbonizing our LCA through bundled RECs or purchase power agreements, because we think that's the most practical solution, probably that even gets us through 2030. When we've talked to renewable project developers, and as I said, I kind of highlighted, even getting on something like Rocky Mountain Power's list to build out a substation or build out transmission lines, we're talking about 3 or 4 years. When I talk to renewable power developers, we're talking like 6 or 7 years before they'll commit to building out a renewable kind of power opportunity for us. And part of that is, they just plan out their projects many years in advance. So how do you make the timeline work? As you said, they're not necessarily committed to building out close to geological sequestration. So those things all kind of make that solution kind of really challenging for us right now. I do know, and just wanted to kind of throw out that we are really supportive of kind of all of the above energy, as I've said. In my mind, the future of DAC, and this is probably 2035 and beyond, is DAC and nuclear. That's really the type of energy that we need to do the things that we need to do to get to, terawatts of capacity and billions of tons of DAC. But we have to get somewhere first and show that these plants can be profitable and these plants can work at kind of a, megaton stage or so before we can kind of get to that point. But that point will be here before we know it, right? In 2035 is going to come pretty quickly.
Maybe just a quick follow-up on the question about intermittency. It sounds like it's potentially a dual challenge of both the capacity factor, you want to run it as much as you can to get the most out of your investment, but are there technical trade-offs to ramping up and down from a performance perspective? And are there pathways for reducing those, or is it just something that's baked in?
I could say we have looked at it, right? And we can switch it off, right? So there might be scenarios, even when we're on a utility grid, where there is, if you think about California and what's happened over the past year, there are times when the California grid says, hey, everybody needs to turn off everything they can. So if there's something that's being planned and there is a major event, we can certainly shut down the system. It's not like kind of a nuclear power plant or even, some types of coal-fired power plants where turning things down and turning them back on have a very long lead times. So I would say it's probably really more around kind of the capital costs and whether or not it makes sense for us to be turning things down. Now, if we were to try to turn it, do it intermittently, like, oh, I'm turning it off, I'm turning it on, I'm turning it off, I'm turning it off. I think that my technical team would also say, that's probably not feasible, Patricia. There's probably some design elements that we have not accounted for that type of intermittency. But obviously, there's always going to be maintenance on systems. So systems are made to be turned off on occasion, but not really intermittently.
So, and I think your experience is very typical of what I've heard from DAC technology developers out there. So there's a couple of different things we're integrating potentially with DAC, right? Maybe it's renewables, but maybe it's also waste heat from, say, a foundry or a refinery, someplace where you've got heat available that you're not necessarily using all of. You can do integration with that as well. But you have variable availability of that heat depending on what's going on, time of day, time of year, all of that sort of thing. And that leads you to having to slow down or ramp up or shut off maybe entirely your systems periodically. And we are critically short right now in the DAC area with operability data. So nobody's got thousands and thousands of hours of testing where they say, yeah, we had to turn it off and turn it back on, and that was the impact, and this is the overall life cycle change when we have to do that. So one of the things that we're trying to do right now is figure out how we get that data, and one of the ways we're doing that is at the DAC Center, we have the capability of siting up a shipping container size skid with one of these DAC systems on it, controlling the climate of that, so you can be like you're in Michigan, it can be like you're in Southern California. We'll give you exactly the climate, but we can also integrate that with this availability piece, and we'll allow people to test their DAC skids in such a way that, okay, they can find out if I have 1,000 hours at this level of intermittency, this is what I can get in terms of the impact on performance and in terms of the impact on lifetime of some of these systems.
Thanks. That's really interesting. We need to get to audience questions, but I just want to give one last opportunity to come back to this idea of the role of states and utilities in potentially supporting higher level strategic planning around the capacity needs or clean energy needs for DAC. What would you say utilities should be thinking about or doing in order to better incorporate the needs of DAC projects into their planning?
Well, I think utilities are already under a lot of pressure to think about decarbonization, right? And already you're seeing states who have put renewable portfolio standards, and that's somewhat old term now, or kind of old school, or clean energy portfolio standards. But they're also putting like performance board regulations, right? So saying you have to do a number of things. Your goal isn't just to make a profit; it's to do a number of things to support the community. And some of that has to do with reliability. Some of that has to do with how you maintain, costs, because obviously we all know that there's no consumer anywhere who wants to be paying more for electricity, even if they care really heavily about the environment. And there's also no consumer anywhere who wants to think their electricity is going to go out, even if they care heavily about the environment. So those are all things that PUCs can put on utilities. I do think PUCs need to think about how you put on utilities these issues around decarbonization, both on point source and direct air capture. Certainly, there are rates that utilities charge to whether it be low income customers or wholesale, et cetera, and some of those come from state regulations. So thinking creatively how to make it feasible for utilities to work with us, because they're obviously all businesses and they have shareholders that they need to respond to. But some of these regulations allow them to do these maybe innovative things around kind of pricing and integration with projects like this. And I think it's that type of creative thinking that we really need if we want to solve these problems around energy and DAC.
Yeah. And I'm the engineer, so on this one, I'm just going to nod and smile.
Yeah, I know. Thanks, David. All right. Well, I think we'll open it up to audience questions. And
if you have a question, please raise your hand and state your name when you get a microphone.
Thank you. Devin McGreal. So I work for, I'll admit here, kind of a dirty word, a natural gas only utility. So, but I also work specifically in renewables, which I understand for a lot of people is kind of oxymoronic in itself. But it triggers an interesting question that I'm curious to get your thoughts on. Is a lot of the renewable natural gas projects that we work in, landfills probably typically the most common one, they go through GREET models, negative CI scores. Do you think, and I have tough skin, if the answer is no, we would never even go that route, completely understand. But just thinking about it from an economics, obviously there's the heat advantageous using natural gas versus electricity, especially if it is cogen. Is there ever a consideration to say whether through direct sourcing from those projects or even similar to RECs, there's the RTCs in our world, purchasing some kind of RTCs, is there ever a consideration to go that path, or is it just that's such a verboten world that we just can't go into it?
I would say from our perspective, there is nothing off the table. These are huge projects that have huge challenges and require, innovative solutions. What we've heard from our customers and why we focused on utilities and what I say bundled RECs is we want to show that we are working with the utilities to bring on additional clean energy or help decarbonize their grid rather than bring on a lot of emissions from outside sources and then go the traditional renewable energy credits, because we're not demonstrating progression with the grids that we're on. So I would say that would be the challenge with something like that. But as relates to what our customers expect from us today is they expect for us to essentially account for all the emissions that are used from our activities and then to get a purchase power agreement or a bundled REC with that grid and demonstrate how we are supporting the additionality of clean energy on that grid. So, that's that's really what we think is the most practical approach for us moving forward. Now, at the same time, how we talk about additionality is we actually do have an energy RFP that's coming out where we'll ask renewable energy developers, hey, are you interested in developing in Wyoming? Could we bring you in? And maybe there's at some point where we do have some amount of behind the meter renewables and some amount of utility integration because we've developed this kind of hybrid approach. But, again, right now I think that it's going to be in kind of an all of the above approach with a lot of supportive partners who really want to see this succeed, right? If you're just in it to kind of make money as a renewable energy developer, then probably DAC isn't the pathway for you because it's a little bit hard, right? So it has to be you who are really committed to the efforts.
I'd say a lot of pathways have been looked at using biogas and integration with natural gas and those sorts of things. At the end of the day, what really matters is what the overall cost per ton of CO2 captured from the atmosphere is and what the actual net reduction in CO2 in the atmosphere looks like. So if there are pathways that make sense there, then yeah, those need to be looked at as well.
And I'll just throw out one other thing about kind of Wyoming and how we're looking at it. If anyone's been following Project Bison, we've been looking at Sweetwater and we continue to be committed to Sweetwater. But obviously Wyoming has a lot of great geology. They have a lot of energy projects going throughout the state. So there certainly is a pathway where even for the DAC hub, we're mixing up things with Sweetwater with things going up in Powder River Basin. It's really working, as we talked about, or as Max talked about, with the community, even on siting, right? Does it make sense to have all this activity in one part of the state, or does it make sense to have energy projects and sequestration projects and kind of building going on in multiple parts of the state? Those are all things that we are still working on. So this concept of kind of energy is still an evolving concept in the state of Wyoming.
Yes, this is Maury Wolfson again. I'm responding to the question that was asked about the involvement of public utilities commissions, for example, to provide some kind of incentive for carbon dioxide removal. And I want to draw your attention to what happened in the state of Wyoming, because there was a piece of legislation that passed 2 years ago in Wyoming that basically mandated that the utilities must provide an incentive, that the PUC must provide an incentive for the utilities to do carbon dioxide removal. Well, two major utilities in Wyoming, one is Pacific Corp and the other one is Black Hills Energy, they came up with a study as to what the impact would be on residential ratepayers if this law, which is a statute in Wyoming, actually was implemented. And it came in at $25 per month for the typical residential customer to pay for the benefit of having CDR in Wyoming. I thought I would put that out as information and ask if you're aware of that, and if so, what your thoughts are on it.
I don't believe that's accurate. I think you're referring to some work that the Energy Office did around CCS on point source. Right, but I think it had to do with CCS on point source, so on coal-fired plants and natural gas-fired plants, not carbon dioxide removal. And so, yeah, I can't really speak more to it on that other than saying that it wasn't related to CDR, it was related to point source carbon capture.
Hi, I'm Jack Theroff with Net Power. I've been coming from the past 12 years working on wind and solar projects. And so I had a question about additionality and asking if you're looking at locations where there's high curtailment of existing renewables, particularly in parts of like western Kansas, SPP, is kind of the equivalent to what we heard earlier where there's flaring of methane because there's no way to get it out. There's a huge amount of renewable energy they can't get out from places that are transmission constrained. Are those areas that could work for DAC, or is there an additionality requirement where that wouldn't work out? You wouldn't be able to make the environmental claim that you were using carbon-free or low-carbon electricity?
I think those are locations that will work for DAC. Again, I think that this, the questions on exactly how we're looking at additionality haven't been fully framed yet. And so that idea of where renewable energy is getting curtailed certainly is of interest to us. I think in the short term, again, what's been driving us, as we talked about, is where Class 6 wells are developing. So we certainly are monitoring and being supportive of other projects where Class 6 wells may be in some of those regions. So some of those opportunities have been brought up to us, but certainly we're open to any other kind of opportunities like that that could be brought up to us that could give us opportunities to look at additional sites as well.
And just to almost follow up to that, I think there's two aspects of additionality, right? When we think about carbon removal, it's the additionality of the carbon removal itself and the additionality of the clean energy. And at least from a regulatory perspective right now, because this is still a really nascent field, there are no strict additionality requirements for clean energy for DAC, unlike what's developing around the 45V tax credit, for example, for clean hydrogen. So that could change in the future, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that in terms of how that influences your thinking, looking at the additionality of, or looking at curtailed energy.
Yeah, I would say not necessarily. I mean, certainly we're monitoring 45V, and the European Union is doing a lot to look at CDR, as you know, and think about energy. And it seems like everyone's a little bit more focused on hydrogen now, and so we get maybe a little bit more of a pass, and I think that's right. I mean, DAC is certainly a bit more nascent in terms of TRL levels from hydrogen. I mean, making hydrogen, it's obviously still not commercial that we're seeing it, but in terms of the TRL level, steam methane reforming or electrolyzers are pretty high TRL level technologies. It's just a matter of kind of getting them happening in the scale that we need. So yeah, I mean, I would say we certainly look at that, and we certainly try to stay engaged from a policy perspective. And, our goal is to show policymakers that we're really trying to be proactive on how we look at energy and how we think about additionality of energy and clean energy, hopefully so that the regulatory requirements that may come out of the federal government don't put even, I would say, a bigger weight on our chest in terms of getting these first projects done. Because there's already a big weight on our chest. So these aren't easy things. We don't need more hurdles to overcome.
Yeah, you're rolling the boulder uphill for
Yeah.
sure. All right, well, let's say thanks to our panelists, and thank you for your attention.
Going to take a quick 10-minute break here and then come back for our last roundtable. All right. At WGA's annual meeting in Boulder last year, Governor Polis and Governor Gordon signed a memorandum of understanding committing their states to work together to advance direct air capture solutions. Capitalizing on unique resources and assets of each state can help advance these technologies at a regional scale. Other approaches, such as DAC hubs, can help maximize community benefits and leverage local and regional expertise. Our final roundtable today will explore collaborative approaches to developing carbon removal, highlighting how Western states are in a unique position to advance this technology. To moderate this final session, it is my pleasure to welcome back Governor of Wyoming, the Honorable Mark Gordon.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you all for being here today. I think it's a mark of a successful conference when people are having side conversations, having a hard time coming back into a room and sitting down. And so really what these are intended to do is to spur that kind of conversation and get people thinking. And boy, I got to tell you, the last couple of panels that we've heard have got my mind thinking. And this panel actually will probably bring all of that to, I just admitted to them, I have no idea where we're going to go. But I think that's really a mark of how exciting this time is when you think about the problem that we've set out, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the solutions that we apparently have or in developing, the opportunity set that we can develop that with, and what are the constraints that we look at it. And so if my worry has been that we are so binary in how we look at these things that this panel probably can open up that conversation to talk about where are the cogeneration opportunities, where are the low-hanging fruits that can be picked that really just make sense. And so because these people are much wiser than I am now going to turn this over to Matt to elucidate you all.
I'll give it a shot. So, yeah, I'm Matt Fry. I'm a senior policy manager with the Great Plains Institute. I'll start off with our mission, and it's because we're kind of required to do this, but yeah, we're a small nonprofit organization based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're not as small as we used to be. Used to be 6 people, now I think we're about 45 people. Our mission essentially is to work on things to decarbonize the economy through policy and technology. I do not live in Minneapolis. I actually live in Wyoming. I've been in Wyoming about 20 years. I worked for the state for 18 years, and I've been with GPI for about 2.5. I've got a history of working on natural resources, energy, and carbon management, and I still work on natural resources, energy, and carbon management. So at GPI, we tend to use analysis to help build out our initiatives, use a lot of information based on data just to kind of move forward our policy and our technology initiatives. I'm going to follow the model of using our analysis and using a lot of pictures to describe some opportunities to actually figure out how you may best develop relationships and where you may consider building out these carbon management projects, kind of in the sense of why we're here to talk about this particular panel. So the particular analysis I'll talk about is one that we did a few years ago on carbon and hydrogen hubs. We did this because the federal government provided about $12 billion in incentives to build out carbon and hydrogen hubs. So we used a series of geospatial data to figure out where they may make sense to build out. This first slide, like I mentioned, we use a lot of pictures at GPI to make things easily consumable. I would say this slide is not easily consumable, but what it essentially means is, there's opportunities to utilize the hub structure to build out projects that reduce capital requirements, improve environmental quality issues, and just kind of make the project build out in a more efficient way. So for the conversation today, we're talking about decarbonization. If you're doing that, you're looking at how to reduce your emission profile, make things less carbon intensive as they go out the stack. So if you're looking where to site a project, the first criteria you may look at is where your emission sources are. We tend to look at emission sources that qualify for the 45Q tax credit just because those are going to be the first movers. There's actually a cash incentive to capture that CO2 and to store it permanently in the ground. ground. And just so folks know, those circles there are where we're going to end up. So you can kind of keep that in the back of your mind as I move through this. Once you figure out where potential opportunities for capture are, the next thing that makes a lot of sense to look at is where your geologic formations are. I think no matter which analysis you look at, we're going to have to capture and store a lot of CO2 if we're going to meet our climate objectives, like in the millions and billions of tons of CO2. So if you can actually site your project, no matter whether it be, post-combustion, retrofits, DAC, or if you're looking at opportunities for fuel switching, no matter what you do, if you develop that project in a location that's close to amenable geology, you may save yourself some heartache because it's really hard to build pipelines right now. I included this slide just because we're talking about decarbonization. If you want to look at opportunities for, as I mentioned before, fuel switching, we look at where existing hydrogen and ammonia production are now. There's also some pretty low-hanging fruit for CO2 capture associated with these facilities. This is a busy slide, but I think it's pretty important. As the last panel talked about, low carbon. I hate zero carbon, so I'm going to say low carbon intensity electricity is pretty important as we develop these DAC and low carbon intensity projects. So that makes a pretty high, it's pretty important when folks are looking at opportunities and locations for siting. I'll talk now a little bit about linear infrastructure. So we've got a 2+ million miles of pipeline infrastructure across the country today. Natural gas, crude oil, CO2 pipelines. There's two ways to look at the opportunities to co-locate along with these existing pipelines. First is there's existing right-of-way. So what you see is there's already a disturbance on the landscape. So if you utilize that existing disturbance, you could potentially build out a project with a lesser environmental impact. On the other end of the spectrum, there's opportunities to use existing pipeline infrastructure, maybe for a low PSI CO2 transport or for a low concentration blending of hydrogen and natural gas pipelines. So another thing to consider when you're looking at opportunities to work together on things. I promise I'm getting close. And then the last couple of slides we'll look at is multimodal transportation. I don't think that multimodal makes a lot of sense from an economy of scale perspective when you're looking at CO2 transport or if you're looking at hydrogen transport. But when you're looking at opportunities to bring materials in to actually build these projects, it makes a lot of sense to consider these forms of transportation. So here we look at where the existing railroad distribution are, as well as the existing truck and barge locations. So those are the interstate highways. Not a lot of barge traffic here in the West, but in places where they do exist, they're pretty important. And as I said, those circles were where we came out on the long run. So we're sitting right in the center of an opportunity for a pretty good hub based on all of those physical criteria that we just described. So that's just kind of the opening I wanted to make today to kind of figure out how we may talk more about these opportunities for siting.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a shift to the discussion. That was very informative. Thank you, Matt. I'm Yusha Jami. I'm the Chief Development Officer for Research at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Earth and Environmental Sciences area. We are one of the Department of Energy's national labs, and our area, the Earth and Environmental Sciences area, have been working on carbon capture and sequestration and everything geosciences for many, many years. So we have a lot of expertise in-house. This specific project I want to talk to you about is the Direct Air Capture Hub that we got funded through the Department of Energy this past August. We won this. This is mostly feasibility study, so I'm going to just walk you through it because it's a little bit unique and different. And since we are talking about partnerships, I'm just going to touch on that. Let's see if this is going to move. Oh, here we go. Okay. I mean, we have already talked about this, but I wanted to just highlight the importance of it. We obviously decarbonizing the West, we require capturing carbon and removal at gigaton scale, and a lot of that needs to happen in addition to, we have to capture carbon in addition to transitioning to renewable energy and sort of reducing our emissions at the same time. And a lot of that, after being captured, what are we going to do with the gigaton of, okay. No worries. I can handle this. Okay. So when we capture it, then question is what we would do with it. We had a conversation this morning and in the previous panel about, we can obviously use that, use the CO2 in products and different material, or we can sequester it, which is another way of reducing it. Now, we have been talking to a lot of communities throughout the past year or two and trying to understand why people are concerned about decarbonization and different modes of decarbonization, especially direct air capture or carbon capture and sequestration, and trying to see if there are some scientific questions or inquiries that we need to actually do to make sure whatever we do ends up being done right and doesn't have a lot of unintended consequences. Then 50 years from now, we'll sit down and say, you remember we were talking about that thing? We should have thought about this. So obviously, technologically, we are quite advanced. We can do a lot of these things, but the question is where, how, and what are the different guardrails that we need to put in place to make sure it's done right. The question, obviously, the air quality is one of them. We had a conversation this morning, pipeline rupture and the potential cause of that or the health effects of that. A lot of discussions around groundwater. I know we are in a room full of people who are talking about potentially sequestering carbon, but remember, in the rooms that people talk about water, and I'm a water expert, so I tell you, like, we sit in a lot of rooms and we talk about how that fossil groundwater that's down, thousands and thousands of miles below ground can be used as a source. So we are double counting a lot of these things, and also the question of earthquake and potentially if the injection can cause earthquake. The Outdoor Air Capture Hub is unique because we actually started from the community piece of it. We were really interested to see if we bring communities in to the table, have a conversations with them, understand their concerns, can we actually build this feasibility study, not just around the technical concerns we all have, but also social concerns that exist. And in addition to that, the question of who's going to own all this infrastructure that comes in, how it's going to be operated, who's going to gather the data, who is responsible to make sure this data gathering and analysis is done right, and basically making sure that we are doing this in a right way. It's basically a connected hub. We have a number of DAC companies that are working with us on this proposal. We have solar companies, heat company. We have a carbon mineralization unit that's going to work with us. I'm going to talk about all these partnerships. But the most important thing is everybody who's involved in this project knew this is going to be a community-focused effort, knew that they are going to be, we will need to have community support if this project gets done, and they still stayed and wanted to see how we can move this forward. The project basically will have we're going to establish a community oversight council that's going to oversee some of the decision-making process criteria that are used in life cycle analysis or their environmental impact. We are going to look, as I said, into the ownership model. What kind of business model do we need? What are the revenue pathways? Who needs to own what? What kind of public-private partnerships need to be put in place to make sure this done right? And also, if the jobs are created, who's going to benefit from those jobs? Are these going to be jobs that the local community can get involved in? Can we train them to make sure they can actually have a job in the air capture companies or other startups that are coming to the local community? Or is it going to be mostly construction jobs? So, sustainable good jobs and skilled workforce was very important, and it's more important for communities as well. just to show you how this is going to work, we have a team that's working on the technical side of this, the direct air capture piece of it, potential sequestration, and how all these pieces are going to connect to each other, and what kind of energy source we are going to use. And we have another team of community experts that are telling us what their questions are, what do we need to consider, what are the value systems they want us to incorporate, and also ownership, permitting, and all those pieces. And these two are not going to happen in vacuum. They're not, while they're happening in parallel, they constantly talk to one another. So whatever we do in the community piece is going to inform the technical analysis, and whatever we do in the technical analysis will have a feedback loop to the community. And the oversight committee would be part of the kind of trying to kind of build this vision and making sure we have the right monitoring, reporting, and verification set up, and what kind of transparency we need to put in place. This is a feasibility study, so we're not going to build a DAC up now, but by the end of this, if we have done this right, we'll have a very, hopefully, a community-driven and community-informed project that then can go into the design phase, and potentially we can build it. Just the last slide, these are the groups that are involved in this project. We, the Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and Berkeley Law, UC Berkeley is leading this effort. The Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at UC Berkeley is a co-lead. They're basically leading, we are the co-lead. And then, as I said, we have a few companies that are helping us for the analysis, design, environmental impact. We have community groups, and also we have technology providers, a broad range of them that are working with us. And with that, I am going to hand it off to Ken.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me? Perfect. Okay, there it is. So just very quickly, wanted to, by the way, it'll feel like a bit of a change of pace. I'm here to talk a little bit, kind of be the DAC voice on the panel this afternoon. I've heard a lot about DAC so far today. I'm going to hopefully bring a little bit of a different perspective, although a lot of my talking points, quite honestly, have been taken already, but just keep that in mind. I wanted to start with a little bit of an introduction of myself, obviously, but also of who Global Thermostat is. So I've just recently joined Global Thermostat, just really in the last 6 months, so I'm really on the steep part of the learning curve in terms of the CCS industry and DAC in particular. I spent the first 20 plus years of my career with a company called Air Liquide, so industrial gases company focused on gas separation technology. Essentially, spent a lot of time commercializing different aspects of what we do, or what we did, as I should say, in Air Liquide, both greenfield, brownfield type projects, working with a lot of different stakeholders, obviously collaborating with a lot of partners, building multi-million-dollar projects. So fits very well with kind of the mission, if you will, that I have at Global Thermostat, and the mission that we, I think, have collectively in terms of bringing DAC forward and really kind of building that industry that we've been talking about. I'll kind of segue over to a little bit of a presentation about Global Thermostat. So I'll start from the beginning. I'll try and move through it rather quickly. So we were one of the first, I say one of the early entrants into the DAC industry, or into the DAC space, right? Founded in 2010, really focused on the chemistry. We use also a temperature vacuum swing adsorption system, focused on solid sorbents and contactors. I'd say our business model and perhaps our configuration is a little bit different than what we've talked about earlier today, and we'll talk through that a little bit. But in general, focus really on the chemistry. We have a number of pilot plants, R&D efforts. We've participated in a number of DOE projects. In fact, one that will be shipping out to Hawaii soon to feed CO2 to algae plants, or to algae ponds, I should say. So again, lots of different applications out there for what we do, right? Nice, a lot of intellectual property, protected with a nice patent portfolio. We don't rest on our laurels. We're always continuing to try and drive, we've talked a lot about material science and amine sorbent chemistry. We're always focused on trying to drive all of those things forward, right, for the betterment of the industry overall. I'll speak quickly about the 5 key drivers of DAC. Again, we've talked a lot about DAC today, so I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but I'll speak more from a Global Thermostat perspective in terms of how we manage these components. So as we've talked about, CO2 is very dilute in air, right? 421 parts per million. we have to move a lot of air to get any real recovery of any significant volume of CO2, right? So at Global Thermostat, the way we handle that is again, a air movement system using large, proven industrial high-efficiency fans, pretty much what you would see in a cooling tower or in any industrial facility anywhere in the world. And we move that air through ultra high surface area contactors. We use kind of a unique sorbent chemistry, a amine-based chemistry to capture that CO2 selectively into the contactors as that air passes through. And then we move that into a regeneration phase, if you will. So to desorb the CO2 from those contactor panels where it's collected, sent downstream to either sequestration or utilization application. So there's lots of different ways we can do that. What we kind of pride ourselves on is kind of the physical embodiment of what we've built, right? So it's not just the contactors, the chemistry. It's really the way that we've put this moving absorbent bed system together to really make the capital efficient system that DAC needs to be low cost and scalable, right? We optimize energy. The regeneration is low temperature steam. It's not a high temperature. We can utilize a lot of waste heat in different industrial systems to generate that steam and that temperature needed to free that CO2 for use, right? So again, those are just some elements, but at the end of the day, ultimately what we're trying to create and what we need to drive this industry forward is an inherently scalable platform, right? So we have a couple of different embodiments that we've created. One's our T-Series, more of a tonnage, 10 tons per year nominally type system, like the one going to Hawaii that I mentioned. The K-Series, which is more 1,000 tons per year. The picture that you see on the screen is actually a system that we have operational right now. Over the last year, we had a ribbon cutting on it last year. Governor Polis joined us for that ceremony, along with a lot of other dignitaries in industry and academics. And then we have this M-Series, which is more megaton, gigaton scale. It's really the industrial climate scale solution that we're all driving towards. Each one of these shares the same contactor basic, the same sorbent chemistry and everything else. So that science, if you will, translates very easily from one phase to the next. And again, ultimately, where we're driving toward are these large, megaton, gigaton type installations, and that's what we've been talking a lot about here today, and probably going to be the premise of most of our discussion in this panel. We see the commercial tipping point for DAC being sooner than later, right? More 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 years versus 10 years plus, which is again, there's a lot of differing thoughts on that. Our business model is an original equipment manufacturer. We want to supply the best DAC technology into the marketplace, into that decarbonization ecosystem. We want to be a part of the value chain. We're not going to necessarily be the one to own and operate a system or work with the CDR credits or really be involved in that way. We'll work with sequestration partners and owner operators and developers, but at the end of the day, we want to be the best provider of DAC technology into the marketplace, which is really what happened in the solar industry back in the kind of early 2000s in terms of finding the best technology, promoting it, and then moving the industry forward. And that's what we want to replicate here. This is our leadership team. Paul Nahi joined us about a year ago as our CEO. He comes from the solar industry, so maybe it's not a surprise that we're trying to kind of capture that same approach within the DAC industry. And I'll close on this slide. This is a facility that we have operational here just outside of Denver. The one that I mentioned earlier, the one where we have our 1,000 ton per year unit operating for about the last year or so. More than happy to welcome folks that want to come out and take a look at it, kick the tires on our technology, talk to our team. But within a 2-acre facility, we're able to take microgram all the way up to kiloton technology and test it and rapidly move it through that progression to get it to the market. So again, that's what we're all about trying to do, and I'll stop it there so we can get to the rest of the panel.
Well, thank you, Kevin. That's really the first picture I've ever seen of Governor Polis with a tie on, so I have to say that's wonderful to see, and how you got him there is amazing. I think what we've described here is really an interesting framework, and I want to just kind of explore a little bit how collaborative initiatives can impact technological innovation and how can that be deployed within Western states, and what the policy framework that really could help facilitate that kind of work? Governor Polis and I signed an agreement, and we've also worked between Utah and New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming on a hydrogen hub. These are initial steps. And I guess I'm trying to figure out how we can make that open up more. So pretty much anyone who wants to do it. Nusha, do you want to?
Sure. Look, I think we talked about this earlier too. This is not a technological problem. Obviously, we can improve our technologies and do more. But it is definitely a regulatory and policy need or gap that exists that we need to do. You need to sort of put it together before we start having a successful industry. And also a safe industry, right? Because right now, communities, obviously, when you talk to them, they sort of, you can tell them this is the technology, this is what it does. They can ask you questions, but they don't know who's in charge, who makes sure that you gather the right data, you have the right guardrails in place. You actually earlier mentioned about underground storage. Who owns the underground storage? How do you manage this pore space? What are the different criteria we need to put in place to make sure if people start sequestering, we don't put too much pressure? I mean, we, again, have the knowledge. We just need to make sure there are boundaries set to make sure this is done right. And I think definitely policy and governance innovation, it needs to move hand in hand as we are deploying these technologies. And I think that's when then you start having more financial security maybe come, or money flowing in, because there is a little bit more confidence in, okay, we know the technology, there are policies, and now we can put our money into this and get the right outcome we want. So I think, again, one last thing I would say also, we also need to be much more transparent. I think this is a new technology. Now we can do all sort of data gathering, right? So we have all sort of technologies that can gather data at every part of this process. And we actually have to make sure we leverage those and take advantage of them to make sure we have the good monitoring, reporting, and verification system set up that's transparent and makes sure people and can create confidence in the process. So.
Thank you, Nusha. Matt?
Yeah, I would just add that like the policy challenges, those are things that you can't model. So when you look at the slides that I presented and the pictures that I presented, those are the physical criteria. So that's kind of where you start when you look at these to begin these collaborations. But the policy, in my opinion, probably because I'm a policy wonk, but the policy is really where the rubber hits the road. So when you look at, for instance, the MOU between Wyoming and Colorado, Wyoming is just honestly ahead a bit in the policy game. We have a legal framework in place that allows for storage of carbon. We have Class 6 primacy, all things that Colorado aspires to and is moving towards. They're just not there yet. So I guess the collaboration between the two states makes a lot of sense because one state can utilize the strengths of the other, and conversely, I mean, Colorado has a lot more emission sources than we have in Wyoming, so we can help facilitate some of those challenges for Colorado. So I think the policy perspectives, those legislative frameworks, that's where you really need to dig deep and figure out who your neighbors are and how you can help one another to build out these projects in a more efficient and effective manner.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, I'll weigh in on it as well, but not so much from a policy perspective. I think as the resident sales guy on the panel here, I'll probably speak about it from a different perspective. No, I think in terms of, regional collaboration and ways that, we can kind of work together to drive things forward, right? I think what regional bodies are really good at in terms of being able to do is, kind of swarm internal resources together, right? There's just a lot more available, especially if you talk about cross-state collaboration and having a bigger group of talent to draw on, right? Just to create those support teams, also able to attract external resources as well in terms of talent, in terms of commercial interest, and really kind of physical resources that might be available. Sharing best practices across teams in terms of what's worked, what hasn't worked, what are we doing over here that's different than maybe how you guys would approach it from a different perspective, or having different resources available. Again, in developing policies, incentives, grants, tax credits, those are all things that I think, again, we've talked a lot about DAC, especially being in kind of a nascent space in terms of an industry, and those are the things that can help. I say it all the time, but kind of help get that flywheel, that business flywheel spinning, because once it starts to spin and once it starts to get its own momentum, it can move forward on its own, right? It just needs the structure, probably needs some of the support to make that happen in the early days of what we're doing. And I think if we look at collaborating across states, I think there's just a lot of resources that could be pulled together to make that happen.
Yeah, and it is interesting to me as I think about it. I don't want to take us off too far, but that policy framework is so important. We have a multi-state agreement on rate setting and the challenges, and of course, some of us in the West rankle at California's leadership on some of these issues. Maury brought up Wyoming's leadership, which was to say that we have a number of coal plants that are reaching near end of life. They're being depreciated. We have a lot of renewables that are coming online. They cost money. That requires a lot of grid infrastructure that we don't usually put into the cost of what that development. We talk about it as clean energy, but without all the attendant costs that come there. And so really thinking about all of this in terms of marginal cost is something that I wish that PUCs could do a little bit more, because PSCs, in our case PUCs, generally think about how do we tamp down rate increases for the points Patricia made. Nobody wants to spend more money, but they also want to see regular power. They want to be confident about that. And yet all of these things come with a cost. And somehow in that national narrative, we don't talk about that. We talk about clean energy versus dirty energy, and it's almost this binary notion. And I think if we're going to move forward, we're going to have to build that framework across states. Sorry to do that to you, Matt, but here we go.
Well, I'll just say I agree 100%. I think the answer's magic. I don't know that we've come up with that, but I mean, honestly, there is no great answer, particularly when we start looking at social pushback and real challenges associated with personal beliefs, and people get emotional about these sorts of things. So, I mean, those are costs that we have to consider as well as we dig into this sort of thing. I think honestly, let me say this. I think we're not having honest conversations broadly about how to decarbonize, just because the things that you mentioned now, they're really hard. People have niches of their favorite technology and their favorite policies. So just blatantly honest, I think that these are things that need to be discussed more up front and more honestly, because we have a lot of work to do and a lot of projects to build. And until we get beyond these conversations and these non-conversations, we're going to really struggle to meet your climate objectives, Colorado's climate objectives, and the national climate objectives.
And Kevin, because Nusha was writing lots of things down, I'm going to turn to you. That way she can.
Sure. Yeah, so she can keep writing. I think it's important if we break it into kind of near-term and long-term focus, right? I think we've all talked about, again, and I'm speaking from a DAC perspective, DAC projects are, with life expectancies, just like any industrial facility is, 20, 25, 30 years or whatever that might be. Again, with continued improvement as we move forward in terms of technology. So I think it's important that we put the near-term policies and regulations in place that help spur the industry forward, but we also keep in mind that these are long-term investments. They need incentives that reflect that, because again, if we have support short-term that carries an investment horizon out to 10, 15 years, well, that's great, but people are making investments on a much longer term basis, and so they need that, again, that security, that risk mitigation that comes with, having a little bit of a little bit more support, at least, again, short term, while we get this industry kind of off the ground. And I think that's an important piece of it.
Okay, I was writing things down. I think a couple of things I want to say. One is, decarbonization pathways can be very different from location to location, right? Each one of our states has resources that we can rely on, and is short in other things that we would love to have but don't have. I think decarbonization portfolio for California might look very different from Wyoming, and Wyoming's may look very different from Colorado. And I think we should acknowledge that we don't need to kind of homogenize this across the board, and we all don't need to do the same exact thing. So making sure we have national policies that incentivizes that diversity of approaches is quite important. That is one thing I wanted to touch on. The second thing is, I think you and I had this conversation a little bit outside. I think we have a chance to do a lot of things again at this point in time. And some of that means that we can take advantage of the synergies that exist across the board rather than creating more linear systems. Then in 50 years from now, they're going to fall apart and we have to do it again. Linear systems are very resource intensive, and they're not very efficient. We have this conversation a little bit like in a second panel about how somebody's waste can be somebody else's resource. And we should actually focus on that a little bit more when we are talking about DAC or other renewable, other decarbonization pathways or other carbon capture solutions that exist. For example, I'll give you an example. There is a DAC hub we are working with as part of our portfolio that Capture 6, that they actually use wastewater as their solvent to capture carbon, and the water gets treated along the way as they capture carbon. I think that's like fantastic in many ways because you are kind of like taking somebody's waste, turning it into a resource, and also generating resource after that. So focusing on policies that can incentivize synergies, I think it's extremely important as part of this as we decarbonize. Now, that goes then down to the conversation, the point you brought up, Governor, about infrastructure investment and the rates. The more we, again, going back to synergies and portfolios, the more we focus on synergies, the cost of infrastructure comes down, the revenue streams are going to be diversified a lot more. We will have more opportunities to do multiple things rather than one single thing. And we certainly, in this time and age we are living, we need to kind of focus on multi-benefit solutions rather than singular benefit solutions. So, the last thing I would say is going back to that portfolio strategy. I think we need to remember decarbonization pathways are not going to be all technological. We need to have a portfolio of nature-based solution and technological solutions all together. We can't put direct air capture in every street corner, right? We have a lot of carbon to capture. So the strategy needs to be multidimensional. So just those are some of the thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, there's quite a few. I want to open this up to the audience, if that's okay. I've got plenty of questions here, but I'm hoping this has spurred a little bit of thought process. And so if there are questions, now would be a great time. If not, I'll go back to my list of questions. I'm not a college professor, but I know how to. Well, great. I think one of the big challenges with regional efforts is, who's the consumer, who's the producer, and how do you balance that in a policy framework? How do you socialize the cost of things that you need to do, and how do we value carbon itself? We have imputed costs that come about, Southern California, for example, with their floods, and it's attributed to climate change and the potential for that, and certainly attributable enough that we see insurance companies unwilling to insure in places like California and insure in places like Florida because of the potentials of that. That started a few years ago when Lloyd's of London said, this is now going to be an issue. That is a cost to consumers. How do we, because I think most consumers say, well, we just need to get rid of carbon. We can do this, but I don't want to pay for it. And so I guess the question that I have really is in that entire policy framework. How do we socialize the cost of carbon? Normally people will say, well, let's do a tax. But taxes are administration by administration. They don't necessarily work. You've seen that in Australia and other places. But if this is something that is going to come forward and is going to be able to support DAC, support carbon capture generally, and support all the kinds of chemistry that need to go in how do we take a carbon waste stream and turn it into useful products, that's going to take investment. So I always do this to my panels, and I apologize. You were all prepared for other questions. But Kevin.
Sure. Let me take a swing at it. No, I think it's a good point. I mean, socializing the cost of carbon capture and the cost of what we all kind of agree needs to happen going forward, and it's a challenging aspect, right? And there's no clear-cut answer. We've all talked about kind of social engagement and kind of socializing, if you will, the message. I think generally speaking, most people will say yes, this needs to happen, as you mentioned. But again, it's I think one of the prior panels was no one wants to pay more for XYZ, for power or whatever it might be, just to ensure that they have, to say that they're now supporting a cleaner, greener type approach to the environment or climate long term. Some will, not all. So in that framework, I think it's obviously it's about the education, it's the outreach, and it's kind of socializing it, more broadly than just say, these kinds of conversations are great, but to really push that out to the broader kind of consumer, if you will, and ensuring they understand the basis for everything that we're talking about and why it's important. But it also goes back, you mentioned consumer versus producer. Kind of goes back, at least in my mind, to, if I think of it from a project perspective, and I know that's kind of bringing it down a little bit more, a little bit to a tighter discussion topic, but, how do we model these types of projects, right? How do we model the cost of carbon, the voluntary offtakes? That market continues to evolve. The price of the technology in terms of what it costs to capture a ton of carbon, it's critically important, but that continues to evolve. So all of these things are dynamic, and they will continue to be dynamic for a long time to come. But again, what we're asking people to pay today may be different than what we're asking them to pay 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road. So I think it's an evolving message, but again, I think it's one that needs to get out to, again, a broader audience, and it needs to be repeated. It needs to be a conversation that continues to happen. So I'll leave it there.
Very good. Nusha, anything? Yeah.
Didn't write as long as the list this time. I think, Ken is right. I think education is a very important part of this. I think incorporating communities as part of this transition process is going to be super important. When people are more involved, they're more willing to pay. If something is out of mind, out of sight, it's harder to kind of justify. People don't think about it. They don't know what it takes. So it's very hard for them to value it. I think more and more the insurance issue is a huge issue for us in California. More and more that's, socializing that to people, like how, and the fact that people are struggling to get insurances, or actually the cost of insurance has gone up so high that it's very difficult for them to pay for it, makes them to think about the sources of carbon. Like how can we actually, it's not just capturing carbon, how can we reduce our carbon footprint in other ways? So I think we need to tackle this both at the source and at the, the capture, sort of the different capture technologies that can come in place. One thing I want to say also, I think you touched on something very important, which is who's a producer, who's a consumer. Maybe I think about this a little bit at state to state. We definitely don't want to end up cleaning one state, polluting another one. We just want to make sure the policies that we are putting is protecting everybody at the same time. And at the same time, people are paying for it and also feel, okay, if, I don't think, for example, one state should pay and then their carbon ends up in somebody else's backyard. So how can we make sure this is done right and this doesn't end up costing too much for some of the communities is also quite important. So it's kind of like the cost of unintended consequences that we are not capturing right now.
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly. I think the easy answer from a policy perspective is a tax, right? Everybody knows the easy answer is a carbon tax. It's just, and even some industry folks are saying that's the way to go, but it's just not politically palatable, and it's not going to happen likely in the near term, if ever. So we need to figure out a way to make this a market. Glenn and I had these conversations years ago. I think Wyoming was kind of on the forefront. You know, we'll build it. You bring your stuff here. We'll charge you to store it here. That with that sort of model, like, I think states have a real opportunity to show that sort of leadership. What happened under Glenn's leadership, honestly, was we had that mentality. The market kind of developed itself, and now we have a market that's sort of starting to establish, and hopefully we're going to build some projects. I think there's ways that other states can follow that model and develop a market, but without the backdrop of a tax, we're going to figure out how to make a market and make some money out of this to actually make it develop.
Well, and I would agree with you. I think that's terrific. So, you know, a couple of last questions. One is we really talk about the West being a leader in sort of promoting this technology. Kevin, with Global Thermostat, really a manufacturer of equipment. To make a dent globally, you know, the West of our nation can make a small contribution. But one of the biggest challenges is what you're going to see overseas. Mm-hmm. You've got countries that are developing now. You've got countries that are pretty well developed. And as a friend of mine says, poverty has never been a good thing for the environment generally. So the challenge, it seems to me, is how we engineer the technology, how we build the policy framework, and how we can then export that to the other parts of the world. Not to go off on a wild tangent, but I just do this on a regular basis. You know, it really does feel to me like the things that we can do here can be incredibly valuable to our local economy, but very worthwhile to the global environment. Mm-hmm. And so again, Kevin, just because that's sort of your bailiwick, let me turn that over to you.
So just very quickly, maybe just to provide a little bit of perspective, and I'm sure the folks from Heirloom and Carbon Engineering would echo this. You know, if I look at, and again, I've only been on board for, you know, and in this industry really for a short time, relatively speaking, but just what I've seen in growth over the last, let's say 6 months, and what we've seen, I guess, collectively over the last, 5 to 10 years has been tremendous in terms of just, again, a growing momentum in this space. If I look at kind of our sales pipeline, our opportunity pipeline as we sit right here, you know, a lot of it is in North America, a lot of it in the U.S., Western states. So we have MOUs, we have projects developing, we have lots of good conversations happening on all fronts. But we also have opportunities that are developing in other countries. You know, it's Spain, it's Denmark, it's Norway, it's Australia, it's New Zealand, and you know, Asia, and you just kind of go down the list. So there's worldwide a lot of interest and a lot of momentum again in what we're doing here in this space. You know, the West, let's say the West will end up probably, not necessarily the Western U.S., but the West, if you will end up probably being the leader in this space for the foreseeable future. But there are a lot of others that are very engaged and want to, are very hungry to pull this technology into their countries, into their industries, and really start to stand this up more and more going forward. And I'm excited to be a part of it. I think there's a lot of runway ahead of us in terms of what we're doing and what we're building.
So being a bit shameless in the proposal here, J.P. Morgan has recently put a lot of money into carbon, and it mostly is in Norway. Same with Microsoft, and so the opportunity set really is here if anybody's listening, and appreciate that, Google being here as well. And I do want to put a shout out to Project Bison. I think this is exactly the sort of opportunity set that can, you're really talking about direct air capture in Sweetwater County. And it is adjacent to an airport. It's a small airport, but sustainable aviation fuel is a piece of that. Cogeneration is an opportunity for all kinds of other industries to come along. Simplot is nearby. And so I think, finding those kinds of pieces, the private-public partnership really can make a big difference. And Matt, I know this is an area that you've kind of looked at when you were kind of working with Glenn. I didn't know if you wanted to expound a little bit on those kinds of opportunities.
I think there's incredible opportunity when you look honestly at what we've done with the ITC and other things. Those are tremendous. They're 100% public-private partnerships, and without those public dollars and those public incentives, I think we're going to struggle to get a lot of these off the ground, thus with the infrastructure law as well as the IRA. So I'm clearly not an expert in public-private partnerships, but I don't think that we're going to be a whole lot of headwind in this space unless we utilize them to their fullest capacity. And I would suggest these folks probably know more about it than I do.
Well, and I was going to let Nusha put a bow on everything.
I think we are definitely looking into public-private partnership as part of that direct air capture hub that we are putting together. And I think it's just, we do definitely need public money, but we also need to figure out how these technologies are deployed and where do they fit into the process, and who owns the technology, who operates it, and do you hand it off to someone, or do you stay on, in place and operate it? So I think a lot of that needs to be put together. I think, we are, for example, we are looking into, for our own little project, looking into some form of a municipal utility, or not a municipal, it's like a kind of some form of a utility that can be the manager of the different flows of carbon, but doesn't necessarily need to own the carbon capture process or any of that. So that's one thing. One last thing I want to say on also, you touched on emerging markets, and I want to say, again, going back to my earlier comment, opportunity areas for each one of these markets are very different. We are much more developed, so a lot of these technologies need to have a place here for us to, I mean, as Ken mentioned, the West probably going to run this because we're fully developed, and we have to come up with a way to capture carbon and do other things that we can to minimize the effect we already has had. But the emerging markets actually have a chance to do things very differently. They can actually build cities that are much more carbon neutral, or can generate a lot less carbon, or have a less carbon footprint, or they can actually think about modular solutions that can put in place to do multiple things. So again, I want to make sure, I want to encourage everybody to think a little bit more about how we can come up with ways to come up with optimal portfolios for every location we are looking at, because that's the only way we can do this right. Otherwise, we can sort of repeat a lot of the disadvantages that we have had in the past round of infrastructure building in this round.
Thank you. Well, let's give a hand to the panelists. And my apologies for taking you off on wild chases. Jack.
Thank you, Governor. Can you guys hear me now? Got it. I'm tasked with a few housekeeping items, but before we go, I want to thank, obviously, our last panelists here, but all of our panelists for contributing to just a thoughtful and meaningful discussion on this issue. It's a critical issue for WGA, obviously, as embodied by Governor Gordon's initiative. So just can't thank everybody enough for providing that insight, and which will certainly help shape our policy recommendations that we'll put forward in the report due out later this summer. So I also want to thank Governor Polis for hosting us this week, and obviously Governor Gordon for joining us today. I'll go a little off script too, because you opened the door for that. But Governor Gordon truly does embody the WGA spirit and the leadership and stewardship of the West that we, quite frankly, as an organization, wouldn't be able to survive without his leadership and that of his fellow governors. But I think it's emblematic that he's here. Make the time to travel down I-25, to come down, and I think as well as join us in Boise and just to host us up in Gillette. This has been an initiative that he put a lot of thought and energy into, no pun intended, but certainly means a lot to him. And so we appreciate just his stewardship and his leadership in holding and convening this discussion. So thank you for that, Governor. And, thank you. it's not always fun to be put on the spot, is it? Yeah, no, it's not. So, no, but really just want to thank all of our initiative sponsors and partners for helping making today possible. And then back to the housekeeping items, too. I want to invite everybody to the reception that will be starting just right out the doors here momentarily. Tomorrow, for those that are joining us, breakfast will be here at 8 a.m., and then we'll kick off our first panel and discussion at 9 a.m. So looking forward to seeing everybody. But really just want to thank, again, our participants and you, the audience, those that are here in person as well as virtually. Just we couldn't be here without you, and appreciate your support for the initiative, but also our Western governors and across the West. So with that, looking forward to seeing everybody out there. So thanks again.